The village sat far from the main road, hidden behind dusty fields and dry trees that had learned to survive with very little water. Life there moved slowly, guided by sunrise and sunset rather than clocks. Most families woke before dawn, not because they wanted to, but because survival demanded it. Among them was a young village girl who had known hardship since the day she learned to walk. She lived in a small mud brick house with a weak wooden door that never closed properly. When the wind blew hard, dust slipped inside through every crack, settling on the floor, the beds, and even their food. Still, it was home. She shared that home with her parents and younger siblings, all of them depending on each other to get through each day. Her mornings began before the sky turned light. She would quietly rise from her thin mat, careful not to wake the others. First came the walk to the well, a long path she had memorized since childhood. The rope often cut into her palms as she pulled up heavy buckets of water. By the time she returned, her arms would already ache. But the day was only beginning. After water came chores. She swept the floor, cooked simple food, and helped her mother prepare what little they had. Some days it was bread and tea. On better days there might be lentils or rice. She never complained. Complaining did not change hunger. When the sun climbed higher, she worked wherever she could. Sometimes she cleaned houses in nearby villages. Other days she helped in the fields, bending for hours under the heat. The work paid little, but even small coins mattered. She handed everything to her mother, keeping nothing for herself. Despite the hard life, she carried quiet dreams inside her. At night, when the village grew silent, she would lie awake and imagine a different future. Not one filled with luxury, but one with choice. She wanted the freedom to decide where she went, what she did, and who she became. Education had always been her biggest wish, but school was a luxury her family could not afford. She had stopped going years ago. It's not because she lacked interest, but because survival came first. Still, she remembered the feeling of holding a book, the smell of paper, and the pride she felt when she learned something new. Those memories stayed with her, even when hope felt far away. Her parents loved her, but love did not erase poverty. Her father had once been strong, known in the village for his hard work. Years of labor had worn him down. Illness came quietly and never fully left. Some days he could barely stand. Her mother tried to stay hopeful, but worry lived in her eyes. The girl understood more than they realized. She saw how her parents whispered at night, discussing debts and rising costs. She noticed how neighbors avoided long conversations, afraid someone might ask for help they could not give. Poverty shaped every relationship in the village. Rumors traveled faster than people. One afternoon, while returning from work, she overheard women talking near the well. Their voices dropped as she passed, but curiosity pulled her closer. They spoke of a powerful man, a billionaire sheikh, known for his wealth and influence. He owned businesses across countries and lived a life far removed from villages like theirs. According to the rumors, he was searching for a bride, not from his world of luxury, but from a poor background. Some said he admired simplicity. Others claimed it was tradition. No one knew the full truth, but the idea spread quickly at first. She paid little attention. Such stories always came and went. Rich men did not choose girls like her. She believed her life was already decided by circumstances she could not control. But the whispers did not fade. Days later, elders gathered in the village center. Men dressed better than usual arrived in expensive vehicles that kicked up clouds of dust. Children stared wide-eyed. Women pulled their scarves tighter, watching from doorways. The girl felt uneasy. Something about the air had changed. Her mother noticed it too, her hands shaking slightly as she worked. That night, her father asked her to sit with them. His voice was serious, heavy with unspoken words. He explained that important people had asked about her. They had noticed her character, her patience, her obedience. He said it like praise, but her chest tightened. Obedience had never been her goal. It had been a survival skill. Her mother avoided eye contact. Silence filled the room, broken only by the distant sounds of the village settling into sleep. The girl felt fear rise slowly like cold water. She asked questions, careful and respectful. Her parents answered little. They spoke of honor, of opportunity, of destiny. Words that sounded grand but felt empty. That night, sleep refused to come. She stared at the ceiling, tracing cracks with her eyes. The dreams she once held began to feel fragile, as if they could shatter with one decision made without her consent. In the days that followed, strangers visited more often. They brought gifts, spoke politely, and praised her family. Each visit tightened the invisible net around her life. She was no longer just a village girl. She was becoming a choice made by others. She wanted to scream, to run, to ask why no one asked what she wanted. But she stayed silent. Silence had always kept her safe. Inside, however, something stirred. A quiet resistance, fragile but alive. She did not yet know what the future held. But she sensed that her life was standing at the edge of a turning point. The village remained the same. Dusty and quiet, but for her, nothing would ever feel simple again. Part of her still belonged to that small house, those early mornings, and those unspoken dreams. Another part was being pulled toward a world she did not understand. One decision away from changing everything. As the sun set behind the fields, she stood outside and watched the sky darken. The wind carried the smell of earth and smoke. She took a deep breath, holding on to the last moments of familiarity, unaware that her reality was about to shift in ways she could never have imagined. The days after the first visits felt heavier than before. The village was still the same on the surface, but for her, everything had changed. Every step she took felt watched. Every word she spoke felt measured. People smiled at her more now, but those smiles carried curiosity, envy, and expectation. Her mother stopped sending her out alone as often. When she did go, neighbors found reasons to talk to her longer than usual. They asked gentle questions, pretending innocence. How was she feeling? Was she happy? Did she know how lucky she was? Each question pressed against her chest like a weight. She tried to focus on work, but her hands moved slower. Even simple tasks felt distant, as if her mind was somewhere else. At night, she listened to her parents whisper again. This time, the words were clearer. They spoke of money that could clear debts, of medical care her father desperately needed, of respect the family would gain. No one spoke of her fear. One afternoon, a car arrived that looked different from the others. It was cleaner, darker, and more guarded. Men stepped out wearing pressed clothes and calm expressions. They did not rush. They walked as if the land belonged to them. Her father invited them inside. She stayed in the corner, head lowered, hands folded tightly in her lap. One of the men spoke kindly, but his words were firm. He said the sheik had heard much about her patience, her modesty, her background. Everything sounded like a list, as if she were being described rather than seen. They said the sheik wished to meet her family formally, not in the village, but elsewhere, a proper place, a respectful meeting. They spoke of arrangements already being prepared. Her heart began to race. She finally spoke, her voice quiet but clear. She said she was not ready. She said she wanted time. The room went silent. Her father cleared his throat. He thanked the men and said the family would consider everything carefully. His tone was polite, but his eyes avoided hers. The men nodded, already confident in the outcome. After they left, the house felt smaller than ever. Her mother sat beside her and held her hand. Her grip was tight, almost desperate. This could change everything, her mother said softly. Your father needs treatment. Your brothers need a future. She wanted to say that she mattered too, but the words stayed inside. That night she cried quietly, pressing her face into her blanket so no one would hear. She felt torn between love for her family and fear for herself. She wondered if sacrifice was the same as duty, or if she was simply being erased. A few days later, preparations began without her permission. Women came to the house to advise her on clothing and behavior. They spoke of how she should walk, how she should speak, how she should look down when spoken to. Every instruction felt like a wall being built around her. She asked again if there was another choice. Her parents exchanged looks but gave no answer. The journey to the meeting place was long. It was the first time she had traveled so far from the village. She watched the road stretch endlessly, feeling as though each mile pulled her further from herself. The building where they arrived was grand. Smooth floors, tall doors, quiet halls. She had never seen such a place. Her simple clothes felt out of place. Her hands trembled despite her effort to stay calm. She did not see the sheik at first. Instead, she was guided into a room where women waited to assess her. They examined her appearance, her posture, her silence. They asked questions about her upbringing, her obedience, her willingness to adapt. She answered carefully, afraid that one wrong word could bring consequences she did not understand. Later, she caught a brief glimpse of him from a distance. He stood tall, surrounded by people who listened closely to every word he spoke. His presence filled the room without effort. He did not look at her for long, but when he did, she felt exposed. Like her life was being decided in that single moment. No conversation followed. No questions directed to her. Decisions seemed to move ahead without her voice. On the return journey, her parents were quiet. Her mother finally spoke, saying the sheik had agreed. The marriage would take place soon. The words echoed in her ears. Agreed soon. Back in the village, news spread quickly. Some congratulated her. Others whispered behind her back. Children looked at her differently now, as if she already belonged to another world. She stopped going out as much. She spent hours alone, sitting near the fields, letting the wind brush her face. She tried to memorize the sounds of the village, afraid she might forget them. Her dreams changed. They were no longer about education or freedom. They were about survival. As the wedding date drew closer, she felt herself slipping further away from the girl she once was. She still woke before dawn. She still worked. But something inside her had grown quiet. On the last evening before she was to leave the village, she walked to the well one final time. She looked at her reflection in the water. The face staring back looked older, more tired, also strangely stronger. She did not know what awaited her beyond the village. She only knew that the life she understood was ending, and another, unfamiliar and frightening, was beginning. As she turned back toward home, she carried both fear and resolve in her heart. She had been forced into a decision she did not choose, but she promised herself one thing: she would not disappear. No matter how powerful the world she was entering, she would find a way to remain herself. The journey away from the village was long and quiet. She sat by the window, watching fields and mountains blur into distant shapes. Each mile seemed to take her further from the life she knew, and yet, in some way, pulled her toward a world she had only imagined in whispers. She held her hands tightly in her lap, trying to keep them from shaking. When they arrived, the estate sprawled beyond anything she had ever seen. Tall walls surrounded the property, smooth paths led to fountains, and the gardens were so large they seemed like a forest of flowers. The air smelled different, not of dust and earth, but of unfamiliar blooms and clean water. She felt a mixture of awe and fear. This was beauty beyond her comprehension, but it also felt like a cage. Servants in crisp uniforms guided her to a room that was warm and bright. It smelled of perfume and polished wood. Every detail was perfect: the curtains, the rugs, even the small trinkets on the tables. She had never seen anything so carefully arranged. She wanted to touch it all. But a small voice inside warned her that she did not belong. Her parents left quickly, promising to return later. Alone, she wandered the halls. Each step echoed. She tried to memorize the layout, fearing she might get lost, but also longing to know every corner, every doorway. The estate was beautiful, but its perfection felt hollow. Almost intimidating. Days passed. She learned to navigate the routines. She was given clothes far more luxurious than she had ever imagined. Made of silk and velvet, with intricate designs she could not even name. She tried them on, but each time she looked in the mirror, she saw the same frightened girl staring back. The clothes could not change who she was. Meals were served in rooms that gleamed with gold and crystal. She tasted foods she had never seen, flavors so rich they made her dizzy. But she ate little. Food could not fill the emptiness she felt inside. Every bite reminded her of the family she had left behind, of the dirt paths, the simple bread, and the love that had shaped her. The Sheikh appeared only occasionally. When he did, his presence filled the room, commanding attention without effort. He spoke in few words, precise and sharp. He seemed distant, almost uninterested in her, yet there was a weight in his gaze that made her aware of every small movement. She tried to meet his eyes but quickly looked away, unsure of what to say or how to behave. The servants watched her closely. Some were kind, offering small smiles, or helping her navigate the complex routines. Others were indifferent, reminding her silently that she was new, an outsider who must learn quickly. There was no time for mistakes, no space for uncertainty. Nights were the hardest. She lay in a bed so large it seemed like a stage, staring at ceilings she could not touch. Silence filled the room, broken only by distant footsteps and the hum of the estate. She missed the sounds of her village, children laughing, wind brushing the fields, and the soft murmur of her parents talking at night. Here the quiet felt empty, almost accusing. She tried to find comfort in small routines. She watered the plants near her room, even though they were not hers. She studied the intricate patterns in the carpets. She wrote secret letters to herself, notes that would never leave her drawer. These small acts reminded her she still existed, that she had a mind and heart that belonged to her alone. One afternoon, she wandered into the library, a room so large it swallowed her small figure. Books lined every wall, some so old their pages smelled of history. She picked one at random and tried to read, but the words seemed foreign, the letters unfamiliar. Still, she held the book close, imagining that knowledge could give her strength, could remind her that she had a world beyond this golden cage. Slowly, she began to observe the people around her. The staff moved with precision. The Sheikh's advisors whispered in corners. And each action seemed like a piece of a larger puzzle she was not yet allowed to see. She realized quickly that wealth created its own rules, rules she would have to learn or suffer. The Sheikh was strict, but not cruel. He expected obedience and silence. She learned to move carefully, to speak softly, to anticipate expectations she did not fully understand. Every small misstep felt like a failure, every tiny accomplishment barely noticed. She felt like a shadow moving in a world that did not welcome shadows. Yet, in rare moments, she caught glimpses of life beyond fear. She saw the Sheikh smile briefly at a joke from his closest aide. She watched a child from a visiting family laugh and run across the gardens. She noticed how the wind played with the curtains, how sunlight touched the floor. Small things reminded her that beauty could still exist, even when she felt trapped. Weeks passed. She began to develop routines that felt slightly familiar. She learned which doors to use, when to speak, when to remain silent. She learned the subtle signals of approval and disapproval. Each lesson came at the cost of her freedom, but also at the cost of her fear. Slowly, she felt a strange resilience growing inside her. She remembered her village often, and the family she had left behind. Each memory was bittersweet, the warmth of her mother's hand, the laughter of her siblings, the smell of bread baking in a small oven. These thoughts gave her courage, reminding her that she had survived worse than fear. One evening, the Sheikh entered her room unexpectedly. He spoke directly to her for the first time, not in commands, but in observation. His questions were few, sharp, and pointed. He asked about her life before, her family, her habits. She answered carefully, weighing each word. It was exhausting and terrifying, yet also a moment of acknowledgement. She existed, and he was seeing her. After he left, she sat in silence. Her heart raced, not with fear this time, but with awareness. The world she had entered was vast, beautiful, and full of rules. She was small in comparison, yet she was still herself. She still had thoughts, feelings, and memories that no one could take away. At night, she wrote in her secret notebook again. She wrote about the garden, the rooms, the people, and herself. She wrote about fear, about courage, about hope. Writing became her companion, the one thing she could control. The one place where her voice was hers alone, She began to understand that survival would require more than obedience. It would require patience, observation, and small acts of independence. Every day was a lesson, every interaction a test. She was learning not just to exist, but to understand the world around her. Though lonely, she started to form small connections. A servant who smiled at her, a gardener who offered quiet advice, even a distant conversation with a staff member about life beyond the estate. Each interaction reminded her that even in a controlled world, humans were never truly alone. By the end of her 3rd week, she had settled into a rhythm. She still feared the sheik, the rules, and the vastness of the estate. But she had begun to notice herself growing stronger, sharper, more aware. She realized that though she could not leave yet, she could observe, learn, and prepare. She knew this world was not her home, but it was her reality. She promised herself that she would navigate it carefully, keep her mind alive, and never forget the girl she had been. And somewhere deep inside, a quiet fire burned, a determination to find a way to remain herself. No matter the wealth, power, or expectations that surrounded her, as the weeks turned into months, she began to understand the rhythm of the estate. She knew when to speak and when to stay silent, which doors led to forbidden areas, and which paths allowed her a moment of quiet. The luxurious surroundings still amazed her, but they no longer intimidated her as much. She had learned to observe without being seen, to move without drawing attention, and to keep her mind sharp. Despite the outward calm, her heart was restless. She refused to give herself completely to a life chosen by others. Every rule, every instruction, reminded her of the freedom she had lost, but also of the determination growing inside her. She started to test boundaries in small, careful ways. She lingered a little longer in the garden than she was supposed to, studied books she was not yet allowed to touch, and asked questions quietly when no one was looking. Each small act felt dangerous, but it also made her feel alive. Her first ally appeared unexpectedly. A young servant, a girl her own age, approached her one evening while she was tending the indoor plants. She did not speak much, but her eyes held a quiet understanding. She whispered advice on how to navigate the staff, how to avoid attention, and how to observe without being noticed. For the first time since arriving, she felt a flicker of companionship. They could not talk freely, but even small gestures, a shared glance or a brief nod, carried meaning. She began to notice weaknesses in the estate system. The security was tight, but routines repeated predictably. She learned when the gates were less watched, which doors were unlocked at certain times, and how to move quietly without drawing attention. Each discovery gave her a sense of control, a feeling she had not experienced in months. The sheik remained distant, appearing rarely, but his presence loomed over every decision. She observed him carefully, noting habits, moods, and interactions with others. She realized that beneath the commanding exterior, he was not infallible. He relied on information and routine as much as he relied on wealth. If she could understand the patterns, she could anticipate his moves and plan her own. At night, she wrote in her secret notebook, recording observations, strategies, and small victories. She began to plot how she might gain more freedom, not recklessly, but carefully. Each day, her mind sharpened, her resolve strengthened. Fear was still present, but it no longer ruled her. One afternoon, she overheard a conversation between the sheik and an advisor. They spoke of upcoming visits, financial plans, and decisions that would affect her life. She listened quietly from the hallway, heart pounding, realizing that knowledge was power. If she could gather information, even secretly, she might find a way to influence her future. The young servant became a trusted confidant. They shared small moments of rebellion, slipping notes into each other's hands, sharing a smile in the crowded halls, quietly observing the world together. These moments reminded her that even in a controlled environment, human connection could not be entirely suppressed. She also began to practice small skills that could be useful. She learned to move silently, to memorize layouts, and to notice details others overlooked. Each lesson felt like a step toward reclaiming a part of herself. She was no longer just a guest or a prisoner. She was becoming an observer, a thinker, and a planner. Despite these small victories, loneliness remained. She missed her family deeply and worried constantly about their well-being. She feared that her absence had placed a burden on them, and that fear fueled her determination. She could not give up. She owed it to herself and to them. As the weeks passed, she began to test the limits of her independence more boldly. She stayed in the library after hours, carefully turning pages and studying patterns in the books. She observed the staff more closely, noting who was trustworthy and who was indifferent. She learned the routines of the kitchen, the guards, and the gardeners. Everything was a piece of a larger puzzle she was beginning to understand. Small acts of defiance gave her confidence. She asked questions of staff members when it seemed safe, sought advice from those who showed kindness, and found quiet corners of the estate where she could think and breathe freely. Each act, though minor, built a sense of agency she had not felt since leaving the village. One evening, the Sheikh called her unexpectedly to his private study. Her heart raced as she walked the familiar halls, noting every door, every shadow. He spoke to her briefly, asking about her daily routines and thoughts. She answered carefully, speaking the truth without revealing her inner plans. His gaze was intense, but she did not falter. She had learned to meet his presence with calmness, even when fear threatened. Afterward, she returned to her room and wrote in her notebook more fervently than ever. She outlined potential plans, considered risks, and mapped out the estate in detail. Each line reinforced her belief that she could reclaim some control. Even in a world dominated by wealth and power, days turned into weeks. She continued her careful rebellion. She learned to anticipate the Sheikh's movements, understood the staff's routines, and discovered hidden paths that allowed her to move freely. She was no longer just surviving. She was strategizing, preparing for the moment when she could take meaningful action. Her confidence grew, and with it, her courage. She began to speak more openly with her young ally, sharing thoughts and dreams, fears and hopes. Together, they became a small network of understanding, a quiet resistance against the invisible chains of the estate. The estate, for all its beauty and luxury, had become a place of observation, learning, and subtle empowerment. She was no longer simply a passive participant in a life dictated by others. She had found small ways to assert her presence, to think independently, and to prepare for a future that was still uncertain but increasingly within her control. By the end of this period, she understood one crucial truth. The estate's rules were not unbreakable. The Sheikh was not omniscient, and her mind, courage, and careful planning were tools that could shape her destiny. She had transformed from a frightened girl into a keen observer, a strategist, and someone determined to reclaim her voice, though the path ahead was still uncertain. And danger remained, she now walked with a quiet determination. She had discovered the power of small acts, the importance of careful observation, and the strength of human connection. Each day brought her closer to the possibility of freedom, and she held on to that hope fiercely, ready for the challenges that would come next. Months had passed since she had first arrived at the estate. Every day had been a lesson, every moment an observation. She had learned the routines, understood the rules, and found small ways to assert her independence. Yet the reality remained. She was in a world of immense wealth and power, a world that did not belong to her. She had become skilled at moving through the estate unnoticed. She knew the guards' patrols, the servants' schedules, and the Sheikh's unpredictable appearances. With her young ally by her side, she devised plans that seemed daring in her mind, but cautious in execution. Every step she took was measured, every action calculated. One morning, she overheard a conversation that changed everything. The Sheikh's advisors were discussing a large gathering, a celebration in honor of the estate's achievements. The Sheikh would be present, and many important guests would attend. They spoke of protocols, security, and appearances. To her it sounded like an opportunity, a chance to move beyond observation and take control of her own life. She spent the day preparing. She reviewed the estate map she had carefully drawn in her notebook, memorized the routes that were less monitored, and planned contingencies. She and her ally shared quiet nods, understanding the stakes without words. This was not rebellion for the sake of defiance. This was a calculated attempt to regain agency over her life. The night of the gathering arrived. The estate was alive with light and sound, the gardens filled with guests in elegant attire. She moved through the crowds carefully, observing and noting every detail. She smiled politely when necessary, laughed softly at appropriate moments, but her mind remained focused on the plan. Every conversation, every movement, was part of her larger understanding. During the event, she noticed a pattern in the Sheikh's behavior. He moved predictably, engaging with certain guests while ignoring others. His attention was divided, and his aides relied heavily on routine. She realized that if she timed her actions carefully, she could slip past unnoticed. Even in the midst of such grandeur, her opportunity came when the Sheikh was distracted by a discussion about finances. She and her ally moved quietly, slipping through the less frequented corridors. Each step was deliberate, each breath measured. The thrill of action surged through her, tempered by caution. She could not afford mistakes. They reached a small, private wing of the estate, a place she had discovered weeks earlier while exploring quietly. It was seldom used, its doors often unlocked, and it offered a moment of respite. Here, she allowed herself to pause and consider the future. This was a turning point. She could no longer be a passive observer. She had to act if she wanted any control over her destiny. In the days that followed, she tested the limits further. She discovered rooms where she could speak freely, where the staff were sympathetic or indifferent. She learned to use small tools to communicate discreetly, sharing information and receiving guidance. Her confidence grew. She realized that knowledge, patience, and careful planning were her greatest allies. One afternoon, the Sheikh called her again. This time, his demeanor was slightly different. He asked questions not just about her routines, but about her thoughts, her feelings, and her observations. She answered cautiously, aware that every word mattered. Yet, she spoke truthfully, revealing insight without vulnerability. The Sheikh listened, perhaps noticing her intelligence and awareness. Though his expression remained unreadable, she continued to navigate the complex social web of the estate, building subtle connections, observing patterns, and asserting small measures of control. She began to feel a sense of empowerment she had not felt in months, even amidst the vast wealth and rigid rules surrounding her. Each successful act of independence, each small victory, strengthened her determination. Eventually, she realized that the ultimate step required more than observation and planning. It required courage. She could no longer wait for circumstances to change. She had to create her own opportunity. Late one evening, when the estate was quiet and the guards' routines were predictable, she and her ally executed a carefully planned action. Every movement had been rehearsed mentally, every contingency accounted for. The tension was high, but so was their resolve. They moved swiftly, but silently, avoiding notice and following the paths she had memorized. For the first time in months, she felt a sense of freedom and motion, even if temporary. Each step was a reclamation of self. Each breath, a quiet assertion that she still existed as her own person. The plan led them to a room that overlooked the gardens, a place she had long admired but seldom entered. Here, she allowed herself a moment to reflect. She thought of her family, of her village, of the life she had been forced to leave behind. She thought of her own strength, patience, and resilience. She realized that, despite fear, uncertainty, and confinement, she had not been defeated. When the Sheikh discovered her actions, she faced him calmly. She did not run or plead. She met his gaze with steady eyes, communicating without words that she had learned, observed, and grown. The encounter was tense, the air charged, but something unspoken passed between them. He understood that she was no longer merely a passive participant. She was aware, intelligent, and determined. In the following days, changes began subtly. The Sheikh did not impose harsh restrictions as before. Instead, he observed, perhaps reassessing his assumptions about her. She continued to navigate the estate with awareness, confidence, and quiet dignity. She had gained something beyond physical freedom, the power of self-respect, the assertion of her mind and heart. By the time months had passed, she had transformed completely. No longer just a frightened girl, she was a strategist, a thinker, and a resilient young woman. She had learned to live within the constraints imposed on her, yet find independence and control in subtle ways. She had built alliances, understood her environment, and reclaimed her voice. Though she remained within the estate, her heart and mind were free. She could think, plan, and dream. She could make decisions even within limitations. She had proven to herself that courage, intelligence, and patience could shape destiny, even in a world of immense wealth and strict rules. As she stood once again, overlooking the gardens, she allowed herself a small, quiet smile. She remembered the girl who had arrived months ago, fearful and uncertain, and recognized how far she had come. She had survived, learned, and grown. And in that growth, she found a sense of freedom that no wealth, power, or rules could take away. Months had turned into a full year since she had arrived at the estate. The initial fear and confusion that had gripped her heart had gradually transformed into a quiet determination. Each day brought new lessons, new challenges, and new opportunities to assert herself without drawing unwanted attention. She had learned to navigate the intricate routines of the estate, understand the staff's behavior, and anticipate the Sheikh's moods. Yet she was aware that real change required more than observation. It required courage, patience, and careful action. She had become deeply observant, noticing patterns that others overlooked. The guards followed strict routines, the staff repeated the same behaviors daily. Even the Sheikh, despite his commanding presence, had predictable moments. This knowledge became her silent power. She could move through the estate without drawing attention, slip into rooms unnoticed, and even gather valuable information about the household and its inhabitants. Her young ally remained a constant source of support. Their silent communications and subtle signals, forming a network of understanding that no one else could penetrate. Her days were filled with careful planning and subtle defiance. She would spend hours in the library, studying books she had once been forbidden to touch. She would quietly practice skills that might serve her one day. From memorizing the layout of the estate to learning the timing of staff shifts, each act, no matter how small, reinforced her sense of autonomy. She was no longer a passive observer. She was an active participant in shaping her own life. The Sheikh continued to observe her, occasionally asking questions about her routines and thoughts. His presence remained formidable, but she had learned to meet his gaze with calmness and intelligence. She spoke with honesty, carefully balancing truth and discretion, ensuring that her words did not betray her inner plans. Each conversation strengthened her understanding of the power dynamics at play and reinforced her determination to remain herself in a world that sought to define her. One day, she discovered a hidden passage in the estate, a narrow corridor that led to a quiet terrace overlooking the gardens. It became her secret sanctuary, a place where she could think, plan, and breathe freely without fear of interruption. From this vantage point, she could observe the comings and goings of the estate, study the patterns of the guards, and anticipate opportunities for further independence. The terrace became a symbol of her growing control over her environment. A small but significant space where she could exist on her own terms. Her young ally continued to provide support, offering guidance and companionship. Together, they began to experiment with more daring acts of autonomy. They exchanged secret messages, mapped out the routines of staff members, identified areas where they could move freely without drawing attention. Each successful action, no matter how minor, reinforced her confidence and sense of agency. She began to realize that her intelligence and careful planning were tools that could shape her destiny. Even within the constraints of the estate, despite these small victories, she remained acutely aware of her limitations. The estate was vast, the Sheikh powerful, and the staff observant. Any misstep could have serious consequences. She balanced caution with courage, carefully weighing risks and benefits before taking action. Her mind had become sharp, analytical, and strategic, able to anticipate outcomes and adjust plans accordingly. She also began to consider the emotional aspects of her life. She missed her family deeply and worried constantly about their well-being. Letters sent secretly through trusted staff became a lifeline, connecting her to the world she had left behind. She shared news of her observations, her small victories, and her hopes for the future. These communications reminded her that she was not alone, that love and connection could persist even across distance and circumstance. One afternoon, she noticed that the Sheikh's attention had begun to shift. He observed her more closely, asking questions not just about her routines, but about her thoughts, feelings, and observations. He seemed intrigued by her intelligence, her awareness, and her quiet resilience. She responded with honesty, speaking carefully but truthfully, revealing insight without vulnerability. The interactions were tense but enlightening, and she realized that she could navigate even the most challenging relationships with skill and patience. The opportunity for greater independence arrived unexpectedly. A delegation of business associates arrived at the estate, acquiring the Sheikh's attention and temporarily diverting the staff's focus. She and her ally used the moment to explore areas of the estate that had previously been off limits. They moved silently, avoiding notice, and discovered rooms filled with resources and information that could aid them in future plans. Each discovery was a step toward greater control and self-determination. As the months progressed, she continued to develop strategies for asserting herself. She practiced subtle forms of influence, learned to communicate effectively with staff, and observed the Sheikh's decision-making processes. She became adept at reading people, understanding motivations, and identifying opportunities for autonomy. Her mind had become a powerful tool, allowing her to navigate the complexities of the estate with increasing confidence. Through careful observation and strategic action, she began to build a sense of authority within her small sphere of influence. Staff members who had once been indifferent or skeptical began to recognize her intelligence and reliability. They offered subtle support, shared information, and provided assistance when possible. She learned that even in a world dominated by wealth and power, human connections could be leveraged to create opportunities. Her confidence grew steadily. She no longer felt like a passive participant in the estate. She felt like an active agent capable of shaping her own life. Each small act of independence reinforced her belief in her abilities, and each successful interaction strengthened her sense of self. She realized that true freedom was not always about physical escape, but about reclaiming control over one's thoughts, actions, and decisions. One evening, she and her ally devised a plan to further test the boundaries of their autonomy. They carefully mapped out a series of movements and communications designed to maximize their independence while minimizing risk. The execution required precision, patience, and courage. Each step was deliberate, and each decision weighed carefully against potential consequences. The successful completion of the plan brought a profound sense of accomplishment and reinforced her understanding of her own capabilities over time. She became recognized, albeit quietly, as someone who was not easily intimidated. Her intelligence, resilience, and careful planning had earned her a reputation among the staff and, to some extent, even among the Sheikh's associates. She had transformed from a frightened girl into a confident, strategic, and observant young woman. Capable of navigating complex social and logistical challenges with skill and poise, she continued to cultivate her mind, body, and spirit, finding ways to grow and learn despite the constraints of the estate. She practiced self-discipline, refined her observational skills, explored areas of interest that had once seemed unattainable. Each accomplishment, no matter how small, reinforced her sense of self and her belief in her ability to shape her own future. By the end of this period, she had achieved a remarkable transformation. She was no longer simply a resident of the estate. She was an active participant in her own life, capable of making decisions, asserting her presence, and influencing her environment. She had learned that true empowerment comes from knowledge, courage, patience, and the careful exercise of personal agency. As she stood once again on the terrace overlooking the gardens, she reflected on her journey. The girl who had arrived fearful, uncertain, constrained by circumstance had grown into a young woman of strength, intelligence, and quiet determination. She had navigated a world of immense wealth and strict rules, and in doing so, had reclaimed her voice, her mind, and her sense of self. She understood that life would continue to present challenges, and that the estate, the Sheikh, and the staff would remain a part of her world for the foreseeable future. But she no longer felt powerless. She had discovered the capacity for resilience, the importance of careful observation, and the strength that comes from strategic action and human connection. Her journey was far from over. But she faced the future with confidence, courage, and a deep understanding of her own capabilities. She learned that even in the most controlled and constrained circumstances, freedom could be found in thought, action, and the careful assertion of personal agency. She was no longer simply surviving. She was living, learning, and shaping her own destiny.